Welcome to PWS United, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to share education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome.
Welcome to another episode of PWS United. This is your co-host, Anne Fricke. Now, this episode touches on the ideas of equity journeys. Where are you in yours? Equity as an everyday practice that is woven throughout everything. The dehumanization of specific identities and how privilege plays a role in that. And if you're saying to yourself, as I know some of you are because I do read the comments, what does this have to do with Prader-Willi syndrome? I say it has everything to do with it. PWS is found in every version of humanity. It does not recognize barriers of biological sex, race, gender identity, ethnicity, sexual orientation, income level, faith, or where in the world someone is born. The power we have to enact change, to advocate for better services, to demand treatment options, is in the community that we have and that we create. And that community includes everyone touched by PWS. And maybe you're unfamiliar with how others are affected by their identifiers. Maybe you've never had to drive 5 hours one way for a 30-minute endocrinology appointment because you live in a place with easier access to PWS specialists. Maybe you've never had to choose which medications you could go without for a month or nurse an obvious hospital-worthy injury at home because you can afford medical insurance. Maybe your loved one fits the classic image of PWS that is taught in medical schools, and you never had to wait for a diagnosis while your loved one missed out on vital interventions. Maybe you've never had to experience the degradation of hiding who you truly are because our society openly accepts you and your life is not threatened by others' opinions of you. Maybe your loved one is not a part of a population that is statistically more likely to be met with forced restraint and seclusion in school, not because they deserve it, but because of the biases of a system. Any privilege you may have to not experience these situations is not a judgment on your moral character or something to be ashamed of. It's something to be aware of, to recognize that because of that privilege, you may not see the whole story or be able to understand how others are truly suffering. And with that recognition, be more open to listening, to learning, and to perhaps become an active participant in a more equitable society. Sometimes people fear that they will lose something in the implementation of equity initiatives, that somehow by opening the circle, they will be pushed out. But that's the thing, circles can continue to grow. Promoting and supporting equity missions does not take away from people, does not exclude people. It opens up the circle and invites more people in. So today we're continuing the equity conversation, and I hope you all are here to really listen. And we have some great guests. So we have with us again Stacy Ward, who is CEO of PWSA USA, and Dini Rao, who is a PWS mom on our board of directors and also on the equity committee. And we get to meet two more members of PWSA USA's new equity committee. Wordna Meskheniten is a change management strategist and leadership coach with 20 years of experience leading in the education, environmental, and nonprofit fields. She has expertise in equity and inclusion, change management, leadership development, and organizational culture. She formerly served as the Vice President of People and Culture with the Wilderness Society, where she organized the first Staff of Color retreat and launched the Flip Hagood Mentorship Program for Equity. She also led district-wide professional development as Manager Equity and Diversity with DC Public Schools and designed the first-ever DCPS Equity Framework. Prior to DCPS, she organized women as volunteer leaders within the public health and advocacy organization Girl Trek as their national field director. Wordna is an alumna of Teach for America, having taught third grade in Houston, Texas. She earned her BA in History from Harvard University and an MA in Change Leadership from Columbia University. She, her husband, and their 2 children reside in Washington, D.C. Dhivya Venkataraman has more than 20 years of experience supporting education nonprofits and public sector organizations, with a career focused on helping organizations strengthen their work and better serve communities. Her approach to capacity building is grounded in equity, centering the experiences of marginalized communities and ensuring diverse perspectives inform decisions and strategy. She believes this kind of intentional work is essential to creating lasting, meaningful change. Dhivya is currently an independent advisor supporting social impact organizations with strategic planning and capacity building work. She has worked with community-based organizations, school systems, nonprofits, and philanthropies across the education sector. Prior to her current role, she served at Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies, where she managed grants in the education portfolio and led efforts to support grantees in building stronger systems and practices. Earlier in her career, she was an associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners, advising education organizations on strategy, talent, and change management. Dhivya holds master's degrees in public policy and business administration from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in business administration from the George Washington University. She also currently serves as vice president of the Board of City Kids Wilderness Project. And if you're not totally impressed yet by those bios, just wait until we get into this conversation. It is a very enlightening and inspiring conversation. And as we get into it, I would like to leave you with a quote, as I like to do, from a book recommended by Dini. The book is called So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Oluo, and she writes, "When we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change." I hope you enjoy this conversation. In the first equity podcast interview we did, we talked about kind of a foundation of what is equity. And Tracy Chin, who is a PWS parent and a medical professional and also on the equity committee, she talked about this graphic that I've seen a lot. And I'm sure you guys have all seen it, but I'll explain it for the listeners briefly. There's 2 pictures and it's like a sports event and there's a wooden fence and there's 3 people standing on one side of the fence. And the first frame shows everybody has the same size box that they're standing on. And that shows equality. But the problem is that one person is very, very short, one person's very, very tall. So they all have the same size box, but they can't see over the fence. Or they can't, the shortest person can't see over the fence. And then the second one, which is supposed to represent equity, they've given 2 boxes to the shortest person so that they can now see over the fence. So everybody gets the sized box that they need. So shortly after that conversation, I saw one that was shared on Instagram, and I'll share it here. You've probably seen it, but if not, it has a third box where they've removed the wooden fencing, and now it's a chain link fence, and everybody can see through the fence, and it says that this represents, without any supports or accommodations, that they're not needed because the cause of the inequity was addressed. So have you all seen this image yet? Yeah, okay. You guys live in this space. Okay. You work in this space. Okay. So that was new to me. So I just wanted to bring that to the conversation kind of as, we get into the questions and stuff. I'm really interested in kind of that difference of what that looks like when you offer supports and accommodations versus how, if possible, do you remove the inequities But before we get there, I am here with Dini and Stacy. If you're not familiar with them, Stacy Ward is the CEO of PWSA, and Dini Rao is a PWS mom and on our board of directors and on the new equity committee. And we are joined by two new equity committee members. I would love for them to introduce themselves. So, Divya, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Dhivya Venkataraman. I am based in the DC area, and my background is in education. So I've worked in the education nonprofit space for, I want to say, almost 20 years. And the way that I've worked in this space is around supporting organizations a lot through strategy development and talent, and also in talent, diversity, equity, and inclusion work with nonprofits that support students in the K through 12 space, districts, charter management organizations. I'm currently working with the state education agency, philanthropy. So, sort of running across all of the organizations and community and stakeholders that support our education system. And within this, my sort of push and work has always been, how do we bring in voices and how do we have an inclusive way to address the issues that we're looking to address in the space? So, when we're trying to serve students who have been historically underserved, what does that mean? We bring in those voices, we talk to those folks, and we co-design solutions. And so that has been a really big focus of my career over the past 20 years to try to do that well. So this equity committee and even the Prader-Willi's world was brought to me because my niece, who is Dini's daughter, Ione, is my niece. And so as I have been in her life for a very long time, we're very close. I just learned about it and I didn't know anything about it beforehand. And so seeing her grow, seeing the supports that she's been provided by her family has really brought to me like what it means to live with PWS, what it means for the community around any child that has PWS. And so as part of that, really wanted to bring in any expertise and support I could to the equity committee in the best way. And then sort of from a professional perspective, really thinking about, this concept of rare within rare feels really critical. And really, it was a very poignant thought, kind of idea that I heard, and understanding that some of these barriers within PWS also expand in healthcare, but also in education, in the way that we receive food in education, the way we receive curriculum, instruction, all of these things. And so as I was thinking about that, was really hoping that maybe I could help in that way. Not having all the answers, but rather directing or bringing questions to then also partners and folks that I have worked with who are experts in this field, and how to think about this to best serve all students and serve students who are working through rare disease, who are working through other barriers and systems. And so I think there's also this really, and this is aspirational, but like, could we come up with the model of what this can look like in a system and in society, of what a like kind of broad-based, community-based care looks like for students in this way. So I'm really excited about this opportunity to be on this committee. It is a committee filled with lots of experts and people doing really cool things in this space. So it's an honor.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you being a part of it. Wordna, can you introduce yourself and also tell us what brought you to this committee?
Sure. So I work in Meskheniten, also based in Washington, D.C. I 20 years ago joined an organization called Teach for America because I was interested in, doing what I could to impact educational inequity, just based on my own educational experience compared to my siblings' experience. I thought that there was something wrong and that because I had had the privilege of having such a great education, that I had a responsibility to positively impact that. So joined Teach for America, and then after leaving Teach for America in 20 whatever, in 20 something, I moved to Washington, D.C. I did Teach for America in Houston, Texas, moved to Washington, D.C., worked with the charter school movement, and eventually found myself actually doing some work in public health, and worked for a couple of years with an organization called Girl Trek, a national public health organization geared toward Black women. So it was organizing Black women to not only get active and healthy, but to get outdoors and into nature. I made my way back to the education space, worked at DC Public Schools for a few years, and became the first full-time leader of equity in that space, and did that for a while. And then looked for another opportunity and found one in the conservation space, where I worked with the Wilderness Society for 6.5 years. leading DEI work there. Also, the first full-time person doing that in that role. Took a career break last year, just some time to, do all the re's. I was just telling someone like regroup, restore, rejuvenate, all of those things, and found myself back in the education space. So now I'm working in the independent school field and serving as a director of multicultural affairs and inclusion, and really continuing to do the work I've been doing for so long in terms of working with school leaders. But in this role, specifically because I work for a high school, I'm also working to impact and uplift student voice and student leadership, both within the inclusion space, but also just within the school community. And I also do some consulting as well. As far as what brought me to the committee, Dini. Dini reached out on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, like you seem like a good person to talk to about this new effort I'm taking on, or I guess really the new phase of the work that I'm doing." And when Dini shared her story with me, I felt compelled to support. This work is hard to do, period. Like doing any sort of equity work formally is probably harder to do informally without the title. And then doing it as a mother, mothering is hard without doing equity work. And so, like, having both in that shared space, I felt very much compelled to support. I'm a mom. I became a mom after I was doing equity work. And I just know that, many hands make light work. And equity work can be very heavy. So I wanted to be a supportive hand for Dini in this effort. I had not heard of Prader-Willi syndrome, but I did recognize, similar inequities that I've seen in education that I've read about and maybe not have personally experienced, but know people who have within healthcare, and anything that I can do to support, like I said, give a hand or, be a listening ear or supportive voice, I think is really what compelled me to be a part of the equity committee.
Thank you. So have you been brushing up on PWS, or are you still pretty new to it?
I'm still pretty new, but I have been brushing up since we, have had the first meeting. Dini sent me a lot of materials in preparation for that meeting, some that I reviewed also after. So I certainly have read up, but still feel like I'm new.
Yeah, that's okay. There is so much to know, and I feel like I have a daughter. I should have said that I have a daughter with PWS who's 14, and she was actually just asking me yesterday about you, Stacy. We were talking about you, and she said, "Does she know about PWS?" And I said, "She knows more than I do." So, like like, there's so much to know and so much different stuff to know along the way.
For our listeners who may be thinking like, oh, isn't this incredible that these sort of outside folks who bring in expertise are coming in and donating their time? And I just want to stress that we purposely wanted to go outside of the normal PWS network to bring in fresh perspectives.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm so grateful to these two for volunteering their time and being so generous with us, because I think that fresh perspective is going to be so valuable in what we're building.
When we had talked the last time, you were just about to have your first meeting. So, can we get into that first? Like, how did that first meeting go? Were you able to define any goals? Did anything new come up? And
Annie,
then
I would love for Stacy to answer this question because, really Stacy was the one white person in the room in this meeting and, newest to this work, I would say maybe. And so I'd love to get her perspective.
Thank you. I'd say my first thought on the meeting was, wow, being in that room and listening to the group talk about their experiences and what they've learned about what we do as an organization and what's happening globally in this space was eye-opening for me. So I've been doing a lot of my own homework, but learned so much in that 1 hour from these guys. And I think that that is going to be really what moves our work forward is the way that it's almost like you guys spoke your own language in this space. You could finish each other's sentences. You all had some similar experiences that I haven't. And I haven't been mentoring or consulting with people in that space either. So it was really telling. We had Ashish who lives in the UK. And the experiences are happening not just in the US. It's clear that this is global and that there are some best practices out there that we can learn from. And when it comes to our goals and our objectives, I would say the one thing that was clear to me was we have a lot of work to do. And I think our biggest struggle really is going to be prioritizing what that work looks like and how we do that. So we want to make progress and have some measurable wins, but there's also some pretty lofty things where progress is going to look a lot slower and it's going to be harder to define what those metrics look like for the community to show the work that we're doing. And that was really clear looking at, our list of objectives and all of the things that we want to do. Some of it is very, very easy. Things like making sure that we as an organization are doing a better job in all of our marketing materials and making sure that we're representing the full community in what we share out. That stuff is a little bit easier than some of the more lofty things that we're going to be working on that really, I think, to an extent, are systemic changes that need to happen outside of our organization, but will benefit us and the people that we support.
I like what Dini said the last time, and I've heard it in like the activist circles of like, you want to have those easy wins that you can get so that people are so inspired to do the work and they see that there is movement. But then, yes, there's also like the much bigger work that is not as measurable, maybe on a smaller scale. So I think it's good for people to know that and to recognize that when they're seeing the work that's coming out of this committee.
Annie, I can share something which was
Yeah,
coming up
please.
for me as we were thinking about our goals too, which is in this work, there's sort of like this is a super simplification, but for the purposes of this conversation, sort of like two lanes of hearts and minds, and then also like the practical work that has to get done. And it's hard. Both are really hard. And there's always, the debate, which comes first? Like, do you have to convince people and get them there in their minds, in the framework that they're using, and then we can get the systems and the processes and the information out? Or is it, we just got to go forward and then this will catch up? And the truth is it has to be done in parallel because you're never going to catch everybody all at the same time. And if you wait for everybody, you're never going to get the practical stuff done. So this point about prioritization feels really smart to me because we have to do both. And we got to do both smartly. And how do we do it in a smart way that is capturing both pieces? And the other part I'll say is it's going to be phased multi-year work because you kind of can't stop. You got to keep going. Got to keep moving every day with it. And so that'll be important.
That's a really good point. I don't see there being an end game in any of this. And I think that's really important for people to understand that we're never going to reach a point where we're going to say, oh, we've done it all. There's nothing more to do in this area.
I appreciate the differences in the voices and experiences. Like Dini said, it was an intentional move to have folks from outside of the community sit on the committee. And it was helpful to hear some of the reflections of folks, particularly parents who have been a part of the committee. I believe Tracy and Dini share their perspective, hearing from Stacy, some of her perspective of like the obstacles, challenges, opportunities. Equity work is so multi-layered, multifaceted. Part of the reason why I've done this work across fields is because it is systemic work and like institutions connect to institutions. And we used to talk about the school to prison pipeline. That's connected, special education, also a part of that. So just having the opportunity to get more anecdotes, more qualitative insights in addition to what I have been reading was really helpful. And I think we all just have different experiences, different locales, different entry points into the equity work. And so it just felt in and of itself like a diverse space to learn, grow, and create change.
Really grateful for all of the expertise. And I think as they're all saying this, the biggest thing that I see as our starting place is just like, where are we right now? Because I think there's just been such a lack of attention and focus to equity in the past in our PWS community that we don't even know yet who we're missing the most and what we're missing the most. So we've just got to start getting some real numbers and some real information from folks, even experiences to know like, what are the biggest gaps? Where are people hurting the most? And, what can we do about that?
Well, so for our listeners at home who are maybe newer to this conversation, We talked a bit about health equity last time. So can we talk a little bit about educational inequity? What does that look like in the schools for our families, for anybody?
Can I start with asking Stacy if you wouldn't mind sharing, because Stacy has sat in on so many IEP meetings, right? With folks who are doing their individualized education plans and with school meetings in general. And you said something to me early on about something even you observed in those. And then I'd love to get Wordna and Dhivya's take from working with the schools and the expert side of their take on that.
Sure. So, one of the things that I've observed in IEP meetings within our community is first, I wasn't really recognizing as blatant racism. And the more I would sit in other meetings, I would see it not happening in meetings where the parent and the student were white. But when they were a person of color, I saw parents' concerns being dismissed more regularly. I saw an assumption, especially if a parent has an accent, that that parent is less educated. And there was almost a condescending talking down to them in those meetings, and where I would be forced to speak up and then call on the parent to finish saying what they were saying because it became dismissive. And I don't wanna paint the picture that this has happened in every IEP meeting with every student who is of color or family of color, but it has happened in enough that it was concerning and made me think, like, "Why is this happening?" So that was something that really shook me to my core a little bit. We spend a lot of time talking, especially in education, about the rights of the parent and the rights of the student. And we think of it from a legal perspective and what is protected by IDEA and your state regulations. And that was the perspective I was always coming. And seeing this really was like, I don't know how to call this out in a way that makes it known that this is happening, but also doesn't damage further the relationship. So in one particular case, I spoke with the family afterwards about it because I didn't know what their preference was during the meeting about having it addressed either. So that's another area that I would love for you guys to kind of give some guidance around that as well, how to navigate those types of situations. But it really was very, very concerning to see how that was happening. The other thing that I would say a little bit more of, I don't know if it's more anecdotal, but I found that children of color were being challenged less in their goals and in the way that their IEP and their supports were structured. And what I will say is, until I started really diving into assessments, well, their assessments are indicating that they have more skills or they don't necessarily need that level of support. So why are they being put in perhaps a self-contained room where maybe that's not what they need in terms of support? So that was really, really concerning for me.
I wish I could say I was surprised by any of that, and I'm sure Wordna and Dhivya are not, and I'm sure the data also supports what you're saying, Stacy, in the aggregate.
That's a lot, y'all. Just like that is a lot. I'm also from Tennessee, so I like saying y'all. The first thing I will say, I'll speak to parents. As I mentioned, I got involved in educational equity because of my own educational experiences. The neighborhood I grew up in, my parents did not want me to go to those schools. And so actively pursued opportunities for me to go to different schools, to go to a magnet school. I don't know what you call it, but some of the things they say about educational equity is your zip code should not determine the type of education you receive. My zip code would have if I had gone to the schools in my neighborhood, but because my parents drove me across town, but sometimes my grandparents had to step in. I had a different educational experience, which led to different educational experiences, which led to different educational experiences. Something I think part of it is my natural personality, but also when I reflected on my experience, I noticed that like being a self advocate in school actually got me more opportunities than experiences. It is really important for parents to be self advocates. I know, especially even as a teacher, parents have can assume that the school has the best interest. And you should assume the school has the best general interest of the students. And you will have to be the advocate for the specific interest of your child. If it's hard, because I know coming from a Southern household, a Black household, it can be hard to interject or to express any, discomfort or dissatisfaction. If that is a challenge, ask questions. That's something I go to just in general. Even if I want to say, I'm like, I don't think my boss is making a good move here. I will just ask a question to at least one, get them to think about what they're doing, or two, make it aware that I'm not just taking in the information, that I'm going to be that kind of parent to ask questions. My husband and I, we tag team in different spaces. Even if you think everything is going well, ask a few questions just to, make sure you feel comfortable with what you have heard and know what your next steps can be. Ask why something changed. Get it on the record. Having things in writing. All of that is something I think is really important to keep in mind, because I think my parents kind of lucked out in some ways with me, but with my children, my husband and I are very active in asking questions, whether it's with their healthcare, medical appointments, education, homework, projects. Like, we're not like always on the teacher's chat line or whatever, but we do ask a lot of questions to get clarity. Why this score? What does it take to get to the next score? What has or has not been demonstrated? How is she showing up? How is he doing this? And so just feel like you have the right, even if you don't, if you feel uncomfortable, say something, or you feel like this is not the right move, say something. If you feel uncomfortable doing that, ask questions.
Brenda, I love that. It's like come from a place of curiosity. And then that way you can kind of preserve what is kind of a power dynamic in the conversation. And so where you're coming in with less information than they know, you think. So I think that that's helpful for me, as I was, Stacey, hearing some of what you were saying, I was thinking about it from like a system wide perspective. And this is not even, this is for learners with disabilities. The proficiency rates, the disparity with students who don't have disabilities is really high. Graduation rates, like the disparity is very high. And that shouldn't be the case. So going to equity, like should that should that even be an identity marker, be the predictor of whether or not you have like high proficiency rates? And I don't think so. Like, this the public school system, this is my opinion. The public school system should serve all students with high quality education. And that, I don't say that lightly, because I think that's it's hard. And the part that I'm learning working with districts, and to be really clear, and I just to qualify this, I have never worked in a special education classroom. I am not a special education advocate or expert. So this is me from a vantage point of working with districts, school leaders, and state education agencies. So I just want to qualify it this way. But what I'm understanding is it's hard because you have both general education teachers and special education teachers supporting students with disabilities. And so they may or may not have the same training. They may or may not have the same understanding of how to use an IEP in the best way. And then the parents don't know what is all this data in here, or they might, but it's not a given. And so the kind of inconsistency, or maybe not necessarily full understanding of how to use the data in a way that can help progress a child's academic experience, can be challenging. And so when I say all students should have a high quality education, I don't want to underestimate the challenges of how we have to bring in different perspectives. But on that note, I mean, how there has to be supports, resources, investment done to have this be done in an effective way, to support parents being an advocate, to understand, I mean, even maybe some awareness. Sometimes I feel like at a baseline of parents are new to, maybe a parent has questions, and that we enter the conversation. There's like training for the school leader and the teacher of like, yes, we enter the conversation with curiosity. And that seems kind of simple, but I feel like even sometimes that shift can be helpful. And I also want to say there are places and schools and districts that do this incredibly well. So there are models to think about and to pull on. Not necessarily answering the question you have of what can be done, but I just always think of this of like, how can we bring both the school and the parents and the student together to understand what is happening in this room when we're talking about an IEP and what is required for academic progression, academic acceleration, social emotional acceleration, positive experiences culturally. And then one other thought I'd add, and I don't have data around this, so it's just something I've been positing of like, can we also confirm and affirm and have culturally affirming experiences for learners with disabilities who are also students of color? I think so. And I think that I hope that happens as it happens with students who don't have disabilities, but there also has to be that element of it. And I think some of the things, Stacey, you were pointing to of these kids are coming in different cultural backgrounds. So what does that mean? Are we honoring that too in these conversations? And then one other thing I'll say, this point you had around like parents with accents coming in and having biases. This is something I can speak to on a personal level. Those were my parents. They came from India. They came into a school system and I don't think that I don't even know, had they ever seen a parent teacher conference? Had they ever seen a parent meeting? Because I don't know that we had until we became, until we were in those situations. And so then is it culturally, do you advocate for yourself? Are you deferential to there's also these like cultural things that are happening. And so you may not even know to ask questions. You may not know that that's the thing you're supposed to do, in addition to the bias that, oh, you are not educated, or I don't want to speak in too complicated of words because you probably don't speak English really well. And so you may not understand what's happening. And so all of those things put both, I think that mindset and those realities put us at a disadvantage to have open and honest conversations that again that could better center the student's experience.
And if I could add to what Dhivya just said, any educators who are listening to this, right? Because, okay, we were just talking to the parents. How can you have that spirit of curiosity as well? Do you have any questions? It's okay if you think your question is, but like, how are you inviting the parent's voice or student voice into the space is, I think, very much key. And to parents who are also educators or to school leaders, how can you bridge those gaps between parents and students, or parents rather, and teachers, particularly students with disabilities? So just wanting to make sure to speak to the power dynamics, but not just to one side of that power dynamic.
Exactly, Wordna. And I think, one of the awesome things that PWSA USA offers to families is this assistance to sit in those meetings. And that's where I think we have the opportunity to educate the educators too, right? And like speak on behalf of like, what is your role in this? And I would love to see more families from marginalized communities taking advantage of that. And I think one of the things that we need to do as both the equity committee, but PWSA USA, is to make the services more aware of all the things we both just talked about. So that when, I remember going and sitting in Ione's speech therapy during COVID, and the speech therapist had Ione and a Muslim child, and she kept doing things having to do with like Easter and, like all these things that our kids don't celebrate and didn't really make sense to them. So it wasn't motivating them. And I kept giving her this feedback and saying, like, can you come up with some content that's more relevant to them? That's going to motivate them more. So, I think there's a lot to be done.
And Dini, to that point, and I'll say something which will be really obvious to you, Annie and Stacey, but I know you've shared with me also experiences that or examples that are relevant to the child who has PWS. So you've shared with me like so many times it's like food or sweets and Easter and the Easter bunny coming with all these chocolates. It's like, well, that's actually not affirming also or supportive in this environment. It's a lot for a teacher to hold, but spaces where we can educate, bring awareness, and not have it be the burden of one, but rather like, can we bring community education in and awareness? And I know that's not exactly on the cultural front, but I've always thought about that of like, there is an element too of like having to use different, to be mindful of the diversity and the diverse needs of students coming in at any moment.
As you guys were talking, I was thinking about the training that we provide for school districts, whether it's a classroom specifically or all of the teachers in the whole district or just the nursing staff, whatever it might look like. We focus so much on the PWS specific needs that we don't talk about the cultural needs. at all. And it just has me realizing that that's another area that we could change that training, and it would benefit not just the student with PWS, but other students in that district if we were to do that.
Something that came up for me as listening to you all talk, which I think is a relevant part of the conversation, but I grew up in Southern Indiana, and you just went to the school that was in your district. Now I live in California. We get to choose where children go, or we get to try and choose where our children go. And my oldest daughter, when she was younger, we were living out in the hills, and I was homeschooling her. And at the time, a good friend of mine was getting her PhD in education, and she she would just harass me about homeschooling because her thing was like, Annie, like, we need parents like you in the public schools to help make it better. The choice was this celebrating Columbus Day. Here are worksheets. That was the school option, which I was not into. So I just think about that. Like, should we have freedom of choice for schools, or should we really be pushed to stay in our specific communities and really put that effort in? I think that's part of this conversation, but maybe not.
I guess it can be. What I will say, that's a really big question, and I think it depends on the role you seek to play, and what your capacity is. One thing I remember, I think I said this years ago, I was on a hiring committee, and someone asked about the equity changes that were happening internally, and it was an internal candidate. And I said to them, like, I think our eyes are too big for our stomach. And so I think whatever role you seek to play, like, you need to know that you're going to have to eat what you put on your plate. I think considering your capacity, your skill set, because yes, and it would be great if you were that kind of parent in the school district, but maybe your daughter's gonna go to a school just like last year. My daughter went to a school on the other side of town that we were really happy to have her in, both of my children actually. And it was a school that actually had done equity work with many moons ago before I became a wife and mom. And so I loved the school, but it was like 35 minutes away one way, which took a lot of time out of our day, which meant I was less active in that school community. But that was a school at the time that we felt like, okay, this is a school that's going based on the lottery results that we to get the academic rigor that we were looking for. And so I think every parent has to sit with that choice. My husband and I talk about this a lot. How much can we take on, like, on a wide scale, a larger scale, and how much do we feel like we need to do specifically for our children? I do think it's a really personal choice, and some of us have the privileges to make different choices in different ways, and some of us don't. But I don't necessarily think any choice made for a parent for their child is the wrong one. So it really, to me, is just a matter of, like, how much can you take on? I can be more active now. Our school, like, we finally got them into a school that's much closer, so I can be more active.
I'm not sure I have much more to add other than I just really agree with the sentiment of like any choice the parent makes for their kid is done, with the intent of helping, serving, being there for their kid. And it's super hard. Are you doing the right thing? And then are you doing the right thing for your community? And then even if you think you're doing the right thing and 3 years go by and it's like, is this the right place for my kid? It's just all the parent struggles. And so I think it's a challenging question. Yeah, and I think it's like whatever you find yourself doing is the place that is best for your kid.
My first thought was your friend is asking you to choose the community over your child.
Yeah.
And that's a really like tough position to put any parent in.
Well, and I will say that at the time, she didn't have children. I would love to address because we don't have just school age children in our community. We also have a lot of adults who seek services. And I wonder if we are as, and by we, I say me, like parents like me are as aware of inequities that may show up in obtaining services as adults. And if it's kind of the similar things that happen to school age children, or if there are some other inequities to be aware of.
I can share that I think one of the areas where I find it really challenging for people to get services is if they live in rural areas. And some of that is because staffing is just less readily available, but also internet is less reliable. And so many of the state service systems, or even county, depending on your state, everything is electronic, or they have moved towards electronic. So if your internet or Wi-Fi infrastructure is not consistent, your ability to even apply and have continual follow-up and feedback, and there's so much work on the parents' end to get services that doesn't happen. As a result, people get frustrated and they stop. It's very difficult to get those types of applications and assessments in other languages. So if English is not your first language, there's another barrier. So those are some of the areas that I personally have seen the inequity in my work prior to coming to PWSA, but working in the provider space.
Well, and I'll just add to that because I do live in an area where I mean, that's been our story kind of ever since Freya was born. Living rurally, you don't have access to services. They can't keep the specialists. If they even have a specialist, they can't keep them in the area. But then add to that, and this is kind of what I'm coming up against because Freya is having a lot of appointments these days, which are down in San Francisco, just 5.5 hours south of me. So that's gas money, that's travel time, that's food on the road. So just it all does kind of compound and, yeah, that can bring a lot of other challenges.
Admittedly, I might not have a lot of expertise in this area or know, but I think that there is space and resources that can be provided to folks like even adult learning or transition into a workforce. And I suspect it's like probably a lot of are there the questions come up again. Are there the resources there? Are there the resources there to serve a diverse community of people with different needs and different backgrounds? And I would be curious to learn more because that's not an area I know a lot about, but those questions come up in the same way they do in sort of the education space of where are we allocating resources, or in the health space, or in economic mobility space.
I was just thinking about the graphic that we started with, and I'm just wondering if you had anything to say or maybe an example of the difference between the providing supports to bring equity to a situation versus what it would look like to remove those barriers of inequity. If you have a response to that, like a vision of what that would look like overall, or if there's a specific challenge that you can think of.
Where now I'm mindful, and Stacy, I'm mindful of taking up too much space. So please, I'd love to kick it to both of you. We're happy to. Okay, thank you. This is the issue when you get a bunch of equity people on the phone. We're all quiet because we're waiting we want to make sure we're sharing the space. I think this kind of goes back to the point I was thinking about earlier, which is we have to do both at the same time. We have to do both the supports to make sure that we are, raising those stools and we also have to break down these systemic barriers at the same time. But the reason we have to do it both is because I think generally these systemic barriers have been centuries in. I mean, they have been built there from the jump. And so to break them down is a lot of work. And I think as we've seen with things happening in the news and the way things have been going, without getting political, it can feel like one step forward, two steps back. But that's also movement work. And so we have to just keep pushing on this to to create resilience in the movements towards breaking down systemic barriers, but to also make sure we're making progress in the meantime too and changing day-to-day experiences for folks. So I don't know that I have a reimagined visual of it, but for me, I'm like, yeah, both are needed. Both are a lot of work. And that's where we are, unfortunately. But also fortunate that there are many people who are part of these movements who care, who want to talk about it like the space here and move in that direction.
I like to answer the question that's asked, but I'm not sure. Nothing is standing out to me to
Okay.
answer is asked. So what I'm going to do is give her a different metaphor that
Okay.
has become relevant for me. I know a lot of your listeners are still learning on their equity journey, and so I want to be mindful of that. At the same time, I appreciate where I am on mine. When I told someone, I think this is last year. I think I've only said this out loud once. In a lot of ways, no, twice. I feel like equity, DEI, whatever people call it, I prefer equity, is like a supplement. And our body is in very much need of that supplement. We're in a deficit of that nutrient. And so DEI equity is a supplement to help us get regulated physically. However, the goal is not to remain on supplements. We really need to change our diet and our lifestyle. Earlier, Stacy said, I want equity to be a part of every question, every decision. That really is the goal. And while, yes, that's the point where we don't need to take the supplement, the point where we don't need to have a specific equity committee where it's woven in, maybe beyond our lifetime, that is still the goal. And so what I would offer is that removing the barriers is making that a part of your daily practice. It is not simply a commitment. Equity is a practice. It's something you have to do meal by meal every single day, multiple times a day. It is the lifestyle that you choose to lead for the rest of your life. That image had so many variations on when you shared, and I've had so many takes on that. I think it's really about recognizing that a lot of what this work is deficit work, like rebuilding what was not done, what was not there. And I think that when we can accept that this is like a practice and something that really has to be a part of how we live or how we operate from an organizational standpoint, and that is actually operationally sound, it just makes for a better organization, a more impactful organization, then I think people will have a easier time getting on board. Yeah, that's the best I can give right now with that. Well, I will add this. I usually say this. That image, I don't love it. I used to like it at the beginning, but it's just, because the people are standing on the sidelines, right? They're supposed to be in the stands, playing the game, owning a team. It's not just about like what they can see and be consumers of. How do they get to invest? How do they get to participate? That is what is, justice, liberation, equity, all the words that we could use. But that is just what it is to be good humans and to, create spaces for others to be good humans.
Yeah, Wordna, if I could add to, I like the concept behind that visual in terms of the intent that it's trying to communicate. And the visual always strikes me a little bit hard, and it's a little different than what you're saying, but that's also a great point. But the thing that comes to me is the short versus tall. There's something in there that innately or like by visual deficit describes the person who needs the box, which would be true, but we also live in a society where everyone's the same exact height, and it's actually that the wall is taller versus the wall is the same height, And so there's like some deficit thinking built into the way that the individuals are sort of positioned in there and like look, that has always felt a little like that's not quite it, you know? And it feeds a little bit into that. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. That's great. That's great. I never saw that. You're right, because it's more individual based instead of system based. Like the system, the way the field has been designed to have certain people not see it. It's not actually about the height. Or rather, if it's, someone's shoes were taken, like if you put them all in heels, someone's shoes were taken, or someone wasn't given shoes. So it's more of it does focus on the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That is so brilliant. And actually, it reminds me under that lens, I don't know that we've really defined the problem in the Prader-Willi community, specifically of how it intersects with this issue of race and other marginalized identities. So I don't know if we can create the time or to continue the conversation, but I really feel like both Dhivya and Wordna could help us give more picture to like the fact that the school systems, our education system, was created truly in a sense to serve different people and to create different outcomes. Is never intended to create equal outcomes, right? So like we have to look at these walls as you're describing it and really define those, because I feel like a lot of folks who have never had to interact with these challenges, who live in spaces of privilege, they don't even know what those are. And so when they say, oh, we have people in the education field and equity committee, it's like, why do we need that? And I don't know if we've properly defined that yet here. And then I'll also add to that, the other thing that I keep thinking of that like kind of breaks my heart in the middle of the night is when I think about students of color, particularly Black boys, who also have the added challenges of the behaviors of Prader-Willi and maybe on the spectrum and, the impulse control issues, all of that, and how the system is treating them. I'm really fearful for the disproportionate levels of discipline to just like how the system may be putting them in the prison system and all these things. And so, yeah, this is something I'm really looking for solutions on too, not in this short conversation, but in general.
I think that's an area, Dini. I think about that a lot, the school to prison pipeline. And I think specifically in our population, the data is not being tracked. So right now, we don't know what those numbers are. I can tell you based on the calls that I've received, it's happening, but there's no good mechanism in place currently for us to track that. That leads me to believe that it's happening more frequently than we're aware of.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer that question in terms of like the problem we're trying to solve. My mind is like going all over the place. So I'll go back to something I didn't talk about earlier. Stacy, I think you were asking, like, why is it that in these meetings, parents of color, parents for whom English might not be the first language, like they're just kind of being treated differently? And something for me that is very core to why I even got involved in equity work is what I came to understand, particularly when I was working with the DC Public School District, is that there's just a lack of seeing the humanity in people that are very different from us. And I'll say it collectively, even though I do think the more privilege someone has, the more they can remove themselves from the humanity of others. But I do think, particularly in this country, there are a lot of ways Black men especially are dehumanized. And it starts when they're young. I have a son. He is a Black boy. I'm married to a Black man. My dad was a Black man. My brother, older brother, young brother, Black men. And, I can look back to their experiences and, things that I work very vehemently to act against is them being recognized as humans. Whether, regardless of if they have a disability or not, regardless of what they're wearing. And I think, this society in general has created the propaganda, the narrative to dehumanize. And then it's just reinforced in our systems. So I think, and I don't think only Black males are dehumanized. I do think that there's a particular like thread that kind of follows all of the systems when it comes to Black males. But I do think a lot of the challenges that we face and obstacles we have to overcome is because there's a lack of acknowledgement of the humanity and the dignity of the other. And a lot of that is systemic. I think in the previous podcast, someone mentioned Harvard's Project Implicit. Used to work with that a lot at DC Public Schools. I think some people connect to humanity through their faith. And I think equity is a way of kind of bringing what some people believe and have a moral compass around into the acts or the decisions of our systems because they don't always translate. So I wanted to make sure to say that as far as like, how do we help create systems that humanize or remove the dehumanization of others? And then the second thing I wanted to say is there is so much to fix. We just start with one part. We're not tracking that data. We don't know all the people. How do we just collect one piece of data that moves us in the direction of humanizing, of no more last? What is that first step that can get us to the next step and the next step and the next step? One of the reasons why I appreciated Dini reaching out was that I could tell her, like, people want you to do all the things. You think you need to do all the things. You can't do all the things. Like, it's just not feasible, at least not all in a short period of time, and definitely not by yourself. And so I'm so appreciative that, Stacey, you're here on this call, you're on the last call, that you're providing not just support, but you're demonstrating your investment in the organization being a different organization, or being an organization that all Prader-Willi families can be supported by. But we just start one step at a time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of PWS United. If you want to learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and how PWSA USA is making strides in advocacy, family support, and research, visit www.pwsausa.org. And while you're there, we encourage you to sign up for our Pulse email newsletter to stay informed about the latest news, resources, and events. Don't forget to subscribe to the PWS United podcast so you never miss an episode. Our team is always available to support families and their loved ones living with PWS 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can call us at 941-312-0400 or email info@pwsausa.org. Catch a new episode next Tuesday, and until then, have a great week.